We're going to talk in this module about running multiple projects. Now, I'm claiming that armed with this method, which we've just been through, there's no project on planet Earth, or indeed any other planet, that you couldn't run successfully using this method. Now, if you're running multiple projects, then if you've got several projects on the go at the same time, will this method work? Well, it will on one condition, that you have enough time to devote to each of the projects, to give them their 10%, if you want to think of it like that, the 10% for project management. But if you're overloaded, as we saw here for instance, then you've got a problem, because then you clearly can't give each project the 10% that it needs. So the struggle to run multiple projects becomes a struggle to get rid of this overload, because if we can get rid of this overload, then we'll know when we're full and we'll know when to stop taking on projects, and we'll have enough time to devote to each project. So that's what we're going to explore here in this module. Now I want to start by drawing you two pictures. Here's the first one. We all have too much to do and not enough time to do it. There's no scale implied here, because clearly it's different for everybody, but this is certainly higher than that. This is true in our work lives, for instance, also true in our personal lives. It's become a bit of a cliche how busy we all are in the 21st century. Now, faced with this problem then, which we pretty much all have, it seems to me that people try two solutions. The first one is they say, it's a time management problem. So I'll do a time management course. Now, I've lost count of the number of people I've asked about time management courses, and they all pretty much say the same 5 things. This is what they say. I went on a time management course. It was a really good course. I started to do what I learned on the course. It seemed to make a difference. But after a while, I fell back into my old ways. Now, if we look at this picture, we can follow that discussion and see how it's true up to a point, but ultimately it's not true. So let's go through it again. I went on a time management course. Yes, there are lots of, it was a really good course. Yes, there are lots of really good time management courses out there. I started to do what I learned on the course. Well, a bit like this course, you've got to do what you learned. It seemed to make a difference. Yes, if you go on a time management course, this will go up. You'll learn things like the 2-minute rule and how to get rid of time wasters and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. And the amount you get done will go up. So it seemed to make a difference. But it's this last thing. But after a while, I fell back into my old ways. I don't think that's what happened. What happened was that the problem of too much to do and not enough time to do it hadn't gone away, because that's not the problem that time management courses solve. They solve a different problem, which is how can I get more done, which is a perfectly valid problem. It just isn't the most pressing problem that most of us have. And often what happens then is that because the time management course hasn't solved the problem that I'm talking about, the people stop doing the things they learned on the course, which is a bit of a pity, because it was making a difference. It just wasn't solving the problem that I'm talking about. So for the problem I'm talking about, time management courses don't work. And this is not in any way to rubbish or debase time management courses. They serve a purpose, but just not the purpose I'm talking about. Now, when this doesn't work then, it seems to me that people feel that they have only one other option, and that is this: they're going to work crazy hours. And I have to assume that if somebody has decided to work crazy hours, they believe that if they could work long enough hours, they would clear this pile completely. And I have to say to that person, you're crazy, you're nuts, you're bonkers. You could never sleep again and you wouldn't clear this pile. You could be granted magically several parallel lifetimes and you wouldn't clear this pile. And in fact, what happens is very quickly, as we've talked about in previous modules, your productivity goes down. You get a temporary boost by working these crazy hours. You know, it goes up a little bit, but then it starts to drop down lower than if you'd just been working a 40-hour week. So in fact, this goes down in the second case here. So for the problem I'm talking about, this doesn't work either. Now this is all a bit depressing. Is there a solution to the problem I'm talking about? It turns out there is. And it's probably the most counterintuitive solution you could imagine, because it's this. We've got to learn not to do stuff. Because if we can learn not to do stuff, then the right stuff will get done. And we will have solved this problem. So the key to solving this problem is actually this. Do less. Now, I'd be prepared to bet that this is the first day in your life that anyone has suggested to you that you're missing this essential skill. Because really, if you think about it, certainly from the day we first went to school, we've been not just taught, but really programmed to do the opposite of this. Remember that first day you went to school? Your mom took you to school, she handed you over to the teacher sat you down and gave you some Lego or a colouring book and crayons or something like that. And they said, go do some stuff. And being the well-balanced, polite child you were, you did. You started doing what they told you to do. And then they had you. And so all through junior school or primary school, the teacher telling you to do stuff and you do, and little homeworks and projects. On into secondary school or high school or senior school, more projects, more teachers, more people telling you to do stuff, the state telling you to do stuff in state examinations. And then maybe you do some kind of third level education, and what do you get there? Theses, projects, dissertations, end of term papers, continuous assessment. And maybe while you're doing your third level education, you get yourself a part-time job and you show up that first night and they say, go do some stuff, wash the floor, or pick up the glasses, or wash the dishes. And you do. And then you get your first career job, and what do they give you there? They give you targets, objectives, key performance indicators, key results areas, and basically up to the day you get taken out feet first, people are telling you to do stuff, and you do. But if you could learn not to do stuff, then the right stuff would get done, and you would solve this problem. So there's a big prize to be had here. So that's the first picture. I'm going to stick it on the wall. This is the second picture. This is your desk. This is your seat. And here's you. Now you probably know from previous modules I can't draw very well, but what I'm trying to show here, if you can see it, is somebody slumped at their desk. You know, chest and face down on their desk. And we could imagine the desk and the seat and you being inside a giant cylinder, like a grain silo with the top cut off. And what happens then is people throw stuff in the top of the silo. We'll start in work. Your boss throws stuff, your colleagues, your peers, your team, your customer, your subcontractors throw stuff. The human resources department throws stuff, the company throws stuff. You go on home and your wife, husband, girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, children, dog, the cat throw stuff. Out in the wider community in which you live, the community throws stuff, the government throws stuff, and you throw stuff yourself. All this stuff comes raining down on your back. It's no wonder our person here is slumped. Now it's possible to have a different picture. Here's your desk. Here's your seat. And here's you. But now you're sitting up and you've got a smiley face, because instead of a cylinder, we've got a funnel. And the funnel has two filters in it. Filter number 1, filter number 2. The same stuff goes in the top here, exactly the same volume of stuff from the same sources. I won't draw it again, but it's identical to this, but now it gets filtered. Some stuff gets stopped here. So that only certain things go through. Some stuff is stopped here. And the result is that the right stuff comes down the neck of the funnel and gets done. Now this first picture this one is just a way of thinking about a problem. But the second one isn't just a way of thinking about a problem. This here is a solution to that problem. And if we could say what the two filters were and make them part of the way we operate, we would have a sort of a working engine. And it would have solved the problem that I'm talking about. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about the two filters and how we could make them part of the way we operate. Let's get straight to it with filter number 1. It says that we need to learn and practice. Now both of them begin with these words there. Learn as in there's some technique or method, and practice, this is the important thing. This is the pixie dust. We've got to do it. We've got to learn and practice prioritizing viciously. Savagely is another word you can use. You can also say brutally. Any words like that. Now let's define this. Let's start by defining prioritizing, because there are different definitions of it. Sometimes you hear people say something like, I have 5 priority 1 things to do, 19 priority 2 things, and 47 priority 3 things. Now, we're going to use a much tighter definition than that. This is what we're going to say. We're going to say, I have a list, just like this list. And if I could only do one thing on the list, this is the one it would be. You then take the remaining list and you ask the question again, if I could only do one thing on the list, what would it be? You then take the remaining list and you ask the question again, and you keep doing this until the list is prioritized. I'm going to ask you to do it in a while. It can be very difficult to do when you have to call it. And you can't have a joint priority, a sort of 7A and 7B. You have to call it. Either one is more important or less important than another. Now, if that's prioritizing viciously takes us a stage further. It says that some of the things you do in your job are unbelievably important. They're wildly important. And by comparison, some stuff isn't. So for the things that are wildly important, you're going to prioritize them as we've described. 1, 2, 3, and so on. 12, 13, 14, 15. And for the things that aren't wildly important, you're going to forget about them. Now, for the avoidance of all doubt, so you're not in any doubt about what I'm saying here, I'm not saying reschedule, postpone, delegate, reprioritize, any words like that. I'm saying throw it over the side. It never gets done. Now, in some ways, this is an unbelievably radical idea, but I have to tell you, you've already accepted this. You accepted this when I drew this picture. And I have to tell you that I estimate that I've drawn this picture for at least 10,000 people now, and not one person has ever objected to it. So we're way past the point where you could object to this and say, well, I'm going to get everything done. You know you're not going to get everything done. So in that case, these things already exist for you. The only real question then is who's going to decide what gets done and what doesn't get done. Now for most people, fate decides. Here's what I mean by that. It's some combination of the culture of the organization where they work, the nature of the organization where they work, the nature of their own job, their own culture and personality, the culture and personality of their boss and the other team members around them, projects that they may or may not be given during their lifetime, firefights that may or may not occur, and a whole bunch of other factors combine together to determine what gets done and what doesn't get done. And all I'm proposing here is that you take a more active part in this. Instead of letting fate decide, you're going to decide. And then this idea doesn't seem that radical. Now, I'm going to give you some time in a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask you to turn off or pause the video and to do this for your list, your equivalent of this list. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of guidance. When I do face-to-face courses like this, I will show people a list like this. It's usually a list, it's usually some volunteer on the course. This is their list of stuff that has to be done. And I'll say, what's the number one priority here? And you'd be surprised that typically people answer project A or other meetings or email or whatever. And it sometimes takes them quite a while to come down to this, holidays. But if this was the list, and the rule is you can only do one thing on the list, many people would choose holidays here. Now my point is not, should this person take their holidays or not? My point is that trying to decide the priority, if I could only do one thing, what would it be? It can be very difficult. But I'm going to give you some guidance about how to do it. Now here are two ways you could decide what's widely important and what isn't. One is with the idea of consequences. That the consequences of not doing one of these things are very severe. By comparison, the consequences of not doing something here are less severe. It's not that there are no consequences, just that they're less severe consequences. I'll give you an illustration. In my job, I have really two priorities: existing customers and new business. In that order. These are my numbers 1 and 2 here. If you send me an email as a result of doing this module or doing this course, it goes straight in at number 1, like the top 30. There's no more important thing I can do than to answer that email. The consequences of me not doing that are very severe. Equally, if I'm not always on the lookout for new business, doing sales, then the consequences of that can be very severe too if those dry up. So this is one way to think about deciding what's widely important and what isn't. The other is with the idea of high value and low value. These are high value, these are low value. If I'm doing something which belongs here or here, which I'm doing right this instant, I'm doing some of the most high value stuff I can do. So pause the video now for a minute and try and decide what's widely important and what isn't. If either of these can help you, that's good. So you're going to prioritize viciously. You can use consequences, or high value, low value. If either of those will help. Now, I know there's an issue here that you can't decide by yourself. Okay, other people are affected by the decisions you make here, but we're going to deal with that later in the module. For the moment, let's pretend that you can decide. It's entirely your choice, and then we'll get to the other people later on. And finally then, if you say that everything you do is widely important, while I wouldn't actually be convinced of that myself, I give you the benefit of the doubt on that one for the moment. So just pause the video now, take 5 minutes, and then you don't need to finish in 5 minutes, I just want you to get a flavour of doing it. And then we'll be back and we'll complete the rest of this. Okay, I don't know how you found that, but generally when I do this with people, they find it quite difficult. But you know what to do now. In terms of learn and practice, you learn to make it. Some things really, really matter and they have to be prioritized, some things don't. So in terms of learn and practice, you learned it. It's as simple as that. Now, how would you practice this? Okay. Well, it turns out there are 9 things you can do. 7 of them are entirely under your control and don't require any say-so from anybody. 1 of them appears to require buy-in, but as I explained, it doesn't really. And 1 of them does require buy-in, but you could get by without it. So a lot of this is under your control if you want to try it out. And the beauty of all of this is that, maybe I've already convinced you. Maybe I'm such a good salesman that I've already convinced you of this, and you're going to go hell for leather, cold turkey, going to start tomorrow. But equally, assuming that hasn't happened, you can just dip your toe in the water here. You can try one thing, for instance. Just put one thing over there and see how that works, and then go on to the next one and the next one, and I'll explain how to do all that. So this is practicing prioritizing viciously. Now, some of these that I'm going to talk about might take a bit of time, but some of them are almost instantaneous, and the first one is instantaneous, and we call it flip the switch. Whether you know it or not, there is probably a switch in your head that is set to this setting here. How can I get everything done? And when the switch is set to that setting, your focus is on clearing the list. How can I clear the list? How can I get everything done? And I gotta tell you, people, you gotta give up on this. This is like chasing unicorns or trying to find the crock of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's pointless. And if you could throw this switch and set it to this other setting, what will I do today? How can I best fill the time that's given to me? Then this by itself would really transform your life. Okay? Because a great load would be lifted from your shoulders, and you would say, okay, I don't have to get everything done. I'm going to see how I can best fill the day with high value stuff. So that's flip the switch. If this switch is set as I've described, reset it to that. And as I said, you could do that in the time that I was talking about. Also to point out, this is entirely under your control. It's a mindset, nothing else. Now the second one is also completely under your control. You could start tomorrow. Okay? You could go into the office tomorrow, or show up for work tomorrow, as though this was already agreed with everybody. Yeah, you can do that. There's nothing to stop you doing that. So, you can start. Entirely under your control. Starting is under your control. Now here's where it gets a bit more sticky. If you stop doing certain things, people are going to notice. The most obvious person who might notice is your boss. So this then brings us to the question of why. Now before I go on here, there might be an objection that's forming to all of this in your head, which I perhaps should deal with, because if it hasn't yet formed, it probably will. You may be saying to yourself, Fergus, you're self-employed. This is your little company. You can do whatever you like. If you decide not to do certain things, nobody's going to question that. But most of us are in companies, we have bosses, there are structures, things like that. Now, so we can't decide like you can decide for us. Now, there's a certain truth in that. There are certain restrictions on you that aren't on me. Restrictions on you that aren't on me. But there are certain restrictions on me that aren't on you. And the most obvious one is to ask each of us the question, what will happen if we don't invest our time in the right things? What will happen if we don't get this split right? And I'll tell you what will happen to you. Your boss will get grumpy. You'll get a bad appraisal. You might get a salary rise or a promotion. Worst case, absolutely worst case, you get fired. Now, by comparison then, for somebody like me who's self-employed, if I don't get this right, then I stop eating. I run out of money. So the stakes are a lot higher for somebody like me. So my point is not that, you know, your job is different from mine, but that we all have restrictions on us here, and they may be different restrictions, but we have them. And this technique that I'm talking about will work for everybody. Self-employed or not, big company, little company, public sector or private sector. Now, this is the one then you got to get buy-in to this idea. How are you going to sell this to your boss? Well, let me give you the gist of the argument. You'll have to find the words. There's probably a timing thing as well. You probably don't want to do it on his or her first day back after a 4-week holiday in the Caribbean or something like that. The ideal time is probably when you've just delivered some kind of project or done some terrific thing and they think you're wonderful. And maybe then, you know, take them to the cafeteria or go out for lunch or something like that and start with this picture. As I told you, I've drawn this picture many, many times. Nobody has ever objected to it. And so you then say, okay, boss, so what I was thinking, given that we all have too much to do and not enough time to do it, how about we agree what really, really matters and what doesn't. For the things that really, really matter, I will give them time, energy, commitment, passion, love, expertise, knowledge, sucking it up if that's what it takes. And for the things that don't matter, can we agree that they'll float away? That's the gist of the argument. You'll have to find the words. Your boss may or may not agree to that, depending maybe on your relationship and how persuasive you are. But that brings me to number 4, which is that you can do it anyway. And here's how I realized this. This was a big light bulb moment for me in my career. In 2004, I emigrated to France and I lived there for 7 years. And I remember the day I told my colleagues I was moving to France. They were horrified. They said, like, is the company closing down? And I said, no, I'm just moving to France. They said, is the company moving to France? I said, no, you're staying here. I'm going to France. And, you know, they were saying, well, like, how's that going to work? And, you know, they were very close to sort of mutiny and sending out resumes and stuff like that. And so it was agreed that if I would focus on these 2 things, then I could go to France. So fair enough, off I go to France. And 6 or 7 weeks later, I get a very unhappy email from one of my colleagues where he says, you didn't do a certain thing. And I write back and I say, well, I didn't do it because we agreed that I would do these 2 things. And he writes back and he says, but you've done it before and it's good. And I write back and say, yeah, but I'm not doing it now because this is more important. And we tennis backwards and forwards like this, maybe 4 or 5 times. And finally, I was getting, you know, slightly irritated. So quite by accident, I said, I didn't do that low value thing because I did a high value thing. And that was the end of the discussion. And this is why you can do it anyway. Because when your boss says to you, or when any stakeholder or colleague says to you, why didn't you do that thing, that low value thing? You say, because I did a high value thing. There's no sane boss on earth would argue with that. So you can do this anyway. This is entirely under your control. And this is kind of optional. You should do it anyway out of courtesy, if nothing else. But it doesn't actually matter because of this. Now, number 5. Now, this is one that you can manage without for sure, but it really is the icing on the cake. And it comes back to an idea that we had right at the beginning of the course, and it was about boxes and clouds. It's funny how that was almost the first idea we had in this course, and it's starting to be the last one now, or close to the last one now. Let me explain. You need to ensure that everything here is boxy. In other words, like it's measurable. For me, here, I have measures for both of these. I don't need to bore you with what they are, but I have them. I mean, this one, for example, is basically a sales target. Very easy to measure. And if you don't have measures for these, and often people don't, because these tend to be things like get the projects done, keep the customers happy. I remember somebody once on a course telling me that his main objective was to be the voice of the customer, and I said, how's that measured? And we hadn't a clue. And the problem, if these are not boxes, if they're fluffy like this, is the following. Let's say, just to pick a kind of a silly example, that your primary objective in your job is to make the world a better place for little furry animals. So you will have a view of what constitutes success. You know that if I do these things, I will have made the world a better place for little furry animals. Because there are no measures, your boss will have a view. And because there are no measures, these two views won't line up 100% as I've drawn here. And then you have several problems. There's no problem with this stuff because both you and your boss think it matters. You'll do a whole bunch of stuff here that your boss doesn't rate. They don't think it's important. And you'll neglect to do a whole bunch of things here that your boss thought were really important. And the first you'll find out about this is probably some annual appraisal or something like that, where you'll be told that you met expectations rather than exceeded expectations. So you need to have measures. And the way to get those measures is to have another discussion with your boss, which begins with the words, hey boss, when the end of the year comes, how would we both know that I've done an amazing job? And how would that be measured? And in the interest of don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, propose some measures. Everything can be measured. Something like a sales target is very easy to measure, but everything can be measured. It just takes a bit of figuring out. And make it easy for your boss to say yes. And point out how easy it'll be then to appraise your performance. You either hit the target or you didn't. Now obviously this is a bit of a two-edged sword, because when these are fluffy like this, you can hide a little bit. But there's no hiding here. There's no hiding with the sales target, for instance. But I would prefer the laser-like clarity that this gives me, rather than the confusion that's down here. I mean, you can see, for example, in terms of this objective, that if it doesn't contribute to the sales target, and it doesn't contribute to this, hey, I'm not interested, it doesn't get done. It ends up over there. Now this one then is not entirely under your control. You've got to get buy-in from this, for this. But you can manage without it, as you can see. And these four are entirely, 100% under your control. Now these four, or these five, by agreement or not, result in the deal. We now have a deal that certain things really, really matter, and by comparison, some things don't. So now the other four things are about honouring the deal. Let's get this one out of the way. So number 6. So this is still practicing prioritising, we should say. You need to honour the deal. Or live the deal. And here's what I mean by that. If something comes into you that you have agreed with your boss belongs over here, forget about it. Get it out of your life. If something comes in that belongs here, you give it all those things I mentioned. You give it the best of yourself and get it done. And you've got to be very strict about this, because if you kind of say, well, I'll do it just this once, then very quickly then this sort of wall here collapses and you're back to the situation where you're doing everything. So that's honour the deal. Now this next one is for people who think that everything they do is wildly important. And it's called test the deal. when you do this, especially for the first time, there will be some things which clearly have to go here. There'll be no question about those. There may be some things which have to go over here, but there'll be some borderline things. You know, you and your boss can't quite decide, does it belong here or there? And usually what happens then is we take a conservative view and we stick it over here for safety, if nothing else. And it's these ones, these sort of borderline ones, that we're going to test. We're going to start at the bottom, work our way up, and at some point, obviously, we have to stop. So here are some examples of testing the deal. Now, one of the most promising ones is meetings. I'm probably older than most of you who are listening to this right now and watching this, but if I had to look back over my life and think of the amount of time I've spent at meetings, I'd have to say that 80% of it was probably a complete waste of my time. And if I could get that time back again, there are so many things I could do with it. Now, it may be different in your organization. Maybe every meeting is very well planned, there's an agenda, somebody chairs it, it's tightly controlled, and it gets a result. But that's not what I've seen generally in the world. So how are you going to test if a meeting is important or not? There's really only one way. Don't go and see what happens. Now, there are lots of ways not to go to a meeting. Here are some of them. You just physically don't go, giving an excuse or not. You can say, call me if you need me, and hope that they don't. You can say, can I do my bit first and get out of there? You can go to the meeting and then a few minutes into it, pick up your phone, look at it, frown, say, excuse me a minute, go out and don't come back. You can arrange with a colleague of yours to tap on a door, call you out, and you don't go back. Now, as a result of this, one of two things will happen. Either the sky will fall or it won't. If the sky falls, then you have your answer. The meeting is really important. You should have been at the meeting, and you've got to be at the next meeting and the one after that. But if the sky doesn't fall, you've temporarily pushed this over there. Now that's a little victory itself, but much more importantly, you set a precedent. If you didn't go once, you could not go again. And over time, something that had belonged over here ends up permanently over there. And that's a big victory. Here's another example of testing the deal, reports. You know, don't misquote me on meetings or reports. I'm not saying that these aren't important, but I know for a fact that just as many meetings aren't that important, or so too reports. Lots of reports are not being read. The first time I realized this was about 2 or 3 years after my company had started. I was teaching a course at an airline, and we got onto the subject of reports, and somebody put his hand up and he said, yeah, he said, I had to send out this report to 50 people, 50. I didn't think they were reading it, so he said, I stopped sending it out. He said one person came looking for it, and he said that person, who was the person who used to do my job before I did it, and obviously had some kind of emotional attachment to the report. At the very same course, the second man put his hand up, and he said, I was told I had to send this report out every week. They didn't seem to be reading it, so I stopped sending it out. After 12 weeks, somebody came looking for it. Now, at best, at worst, that report should probably be going out once a quarter. At best, it probably shouldn't be going out at all. So, again, you know, how do you test if they're reading your report? Well, you maybe know the classic test. You insert a sentence in the report that says, if you read this sentence, I'll give you £20, and see if somebody comes looking for the money. This isn't my idea, this is a very old idea, but the number of people I've said this to, and they said, yeah, never had to pay out. If you don't want to risk the money, just keep sending out the same report over and over again and see if they notice. Or change the date and send it out. You'll soon find out if it's important or not. We're still talking about testing the deal. Another way you can test the deal is when you got your job and you were told what your duties were, you may have been told that this is how we do a certain thing. But, you know, processes can be re-engineered. Things can change. Technology may come along. A clunky, old-fashioned way could be maybe pushed over here and replaced by a more streamlined new way. So that's another example of testing the deal. Another thing you can do to test the deal is what's known as a negative pilot. You probably know what a pilot is, a pilot study where you try something out first. Well, a negative pilot is the opposite of that. Instead of trying something, you stop doing something and see what the result is. So all of these ways are ways of testing these low level, these things that are low on your list here. And you know, you should be able to get some of them permanently over there. And then obviously you'll have to stop at some point. Number 8. There is a little skill which, if you don't have it, you need to learn it. And it's this. You need to learn to say no nicely. Now, one of the things we've said to you is 20 ways of saying no nicely, but you don't need our 20 ways. I mean, this is almost a party game to sit with some of your colleagues and come up with 10 or 20 ways of saying no nicely in your working life. And in fact, in your personal life, this is a party game. You know, get some drinks, sit with some friends, and come up with 20 ways of saying no nicely. It's a skill which, if you don't have it, you just need to beef it up a little bit, because invariably, people will ask you to do things that you've agreed over here, and then you need to say no nicely to them. All of these are under your control. This one, this one, and this one. And so is this next one. It's called the rule of 3. And it's basically the idea that when you come in the morning, that you try to get 3 things done that day, irrespective of what happens. And ideally, those 3 things correspond to these 3 things, the top 3 things on your list. And you can see again how that tightens the precision of what you're doing. It gives you laser-like focus on the things that really matter. Now, these 7 things, 8 things, 9 things, depending. These mean that only the wildly important stuff gets past the first filter. Now, if that was all we had in our bag of tricks, we've already done a good day's work, but we have a second filter, which is going to refine this even further. And the nice thing about the second filter is you all know it, because filter number 2 is this. We need to learn, which you have done in the past 15 modules, and practice, which you have been doing, planning. Or maybe a more memorable way to remember it is this. A little planning beats a lot of firefighting. A little planning beats a lot of firefighting. So here's how all of this stuff that we've talked about in this course, in this masterclass, integrates together. You put this in place either by agreement or not. If something comes in that belongs here, you say no nicely to it. Get it out of your life, neutralize it, kill it. If something comes in that belongs here, well, it's one of these. It's almost certainly dragging some constraints with it, and you know the drill then. Park the constraints, say, I'll have a look at it, build your little plan, agree the plan with the stakeholders, and then execute the plan. And what should happen then is that what gets taken out by the second filter is all the firefighting which would have occurred if you hadn't planned it. That's what gets filtered out here. So the thing gets done with the least amount of effort. And if you were to implement these 2 simple ideas, if you're a person who is busy all the time at work, staying late, never seem to have enough hours in the day, tumble into bed at night with to-do lists going through your head, these 2 simple ideas would transform your life. Because the wonderful thing about doing less is you become a productivity machine. You get so much done because you've filtered this dross out of your life. And as I've said already, if I've convinced you of this, go for it. If not, you can start as gently as you like. You know, try one thing, see how you go, build your confidence. A bit like we talked about when we were talking about the 10 steps earlier on. That's it. That's the end of this module. And that's the end of the course too, in fact. Over the next few weeks and months, we'll be adding bonus modules to the course. There's a few there already. And keep looking, because there'll be more stuff there. And anyway, we'll be flagging it on LinkedIn and in emails to you and various things like that. I hope you've enjoyed it and you find it useful in your working life. Thanks for listening.